little bit about where we've been as we come into the final session of the day. We've covered the what of governance planning, what it looks like, what good governance planning looks like, what it looks like to build your own plan, and included kind of a look back at workbook 1, where a lot of these fundamentals are also laid out in terms of establishing your data collection plan. We've covered the why of data collection through Steve Robert's presentation on the TSA's work in preparing for FDA meetings. So now we get to the final session of kind of strategic decision-making around choosing the vendor platforms, choosing collaboration groups that you might work with to collect that data. And I'm gonna invite Liz Horn back up with me here to convene her panel one last time. And they're gonna share a lot of their experiences with this. So, there's a proliferation today of more user-friendly multimodal platforms, and as featured in the workbook, in this section on strategizing around choosing the appropriate data collection platform for your initiative, Workbook 2 provides an overview of free and fee-based platform models, and also has their extra tips and templates for you to kind of go through your decision-making processes. So I turn it over to this great group. Here you go, Liz.
Awesome. Thanks, Christian. And thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. It's been a long day. It's been a really robust and fulfilling day. Our panel, we're going to talk about how do you select a platform. And the one thing I want to do just to kind of bookmark before we start is that there are platforms out there, and they're all a little bit different. And depending on your needs, different platforms might work better for you than others. So I think it's really important when you're talking to someone who's saying, okay, I'm on this platform and it's just not working for us, understanding more about what their needs are and why it's not working, as well as this platform is working great for us. What is it that's working about it? So everyone's needs are a little bit different, so it's not one size fits all. So I just want to kind of frame that. And then I want to talk about the workbook on page 27 and 28. Here are some questions to start with, to start thinking about platforms and what you need, because you really need to know the questions to ask before you start asking the questions. And Sonia's going to help us out by talking about an assessment they did when they just recently selected a vendor. And we have Shelley and Emily who are going to tell us about their experience from Barth syndrome. So Shelley and Emily, why don't you both introduce yourself really quickly? And I'm going to find the clicker because I didn't bring it over.
Well, I don't need a clicker to introduce myself. It might be fun, but it's the end of the day. So I'm Shelley Bowen, and to Megan's point, I think my claim to fame happens to be that I'm the mother of Michael and Evan and Alana. I got into this crazy business because of my two sons who happen to have a rare disease that we didn't know. It didn't even have a name at the time, and a daughter who was showing symptoms of something that we didn't know what it was. And later we found out that the boys had Barth syndrome and my daughter had Turner syndrome. So we wanted to do something about it, and I was one of some other crazy and wild and crazy people who said, let's start it off foundation. It'll be easy. How hard can it be? Yeah. And so this is our new executive director who says, I'll take that challenge. So this is, so I'll just introduce Emily. So this is Emily, who I'm very thankful to have. I think one of the things I really want to make a point of saying is that when you start with nothing, you have nowhere to go but forward, right? There's nothing, so you've got to do something. So along the way, you really have to let pride came up a little bit earlier, and I think that we need to realize that you have to put talent on task, because people can't feed off of pride, right? You can't cure someone with pride, so it's really good to have talent and people that you really like that are talented working with you. So do you want this clicker? Or
oh, no, it's, and you all know Sonia, who was here in the morning, and she's going to talk to us again. But Shelley, you're actually up first, so you control the slides.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'll introduce myself when it's my turn. Go ahead.
Okay, so let's just have these slides. All right, so let's just start with what is Barth syndrome. So it's an ultra-rare disease. We're aware of fewer than 300 individuals in the world that have been diagnosed with it. The incidence is about 1 in 300,000. The primary symptoms, or the life-threatening symptoms, happen to be neutropenia, sepsis, cardiomyopathy, heart failure. what we found by listening to people is that the most bothersome symptoms are what the first symptom that we hear from families, that they say, this is what I knew something was off. I was talking with somebody earlier, and I think off needs to be an ICD code, you know? So the off symptom happens to be my kid isn't eating right, there's problems with he's not sucking, or, you know, so when we hear that, we typically know there's something going on and weakness there. What we learned through the PFDD meeting, if you start listening, we were talking about listening earlier, is that what's really bothersome is the weakness and the fatigue. And I think our doctors, and I think even pharma was surprised, we were even surprised that it's not the heart failure, it's the fatigue that's bothering them. We do know of some girls who have been diagnosed with Barr syndrome, but it typically affects boys. So where's Nicole? She ought to be proud of this slide. So these are my beautiful children. These are my inspiration. This photo is taken, this is the only family photo that I have of all three of the children. This was taken 30 days before Evan died. Evan's on the lower right. Michael is standing, and Alana is in the center. Evan died when he was 4. We received a diagnosis 2 hours before Evan died, after I spent years schlepping through a medical library trying to connect the dots. At that point, somebody had just described it. It had no name, but it was a characterization of the disease that the boys had suffered with. And I thought, you know, if somebody can describe it, somebody can do something about it. And unfortunately, nothing was done with Evan. But Michael did receive the diagnosis, and unfortunately, he died when he was 23 years old in 2009, and it was 2 days after his birthday. And Alana is 40. If she's watching, she's probably really embarrassed at this point. But these are my greatest, this is really my inspiration for what got me started. So I love this map. This was, it's fondly known as the DAM map at the Open Data Institute in the UK, and I really have to give a shout out to Jared Keller, who has allowed me to use this. I liked this. They have a fancier map now because they've got some, you know, people who've done some really good work, but I think, you know, Jared did a great job with this. It pretty much is what exists in my head when I start thinking about data and pools and pockets of wisdom when we're trying to connect the dots. So where are the people that we need to talk to? You've got the families, you've got government agencies, you've got registries, you've got listservs, you've got Facebook. So listening is so critically important. I think you can't just do a registry and say, okay, that's gonna be where we're gonna get our information. You've got to pay attention to what people are saying on the listserv, because sometimes they might put something, if it's self-reported data, something might go into a registry like, my kid doesn't have any vision problems. Well, why is he wearing glasses? Is there like something else going on? You know, maybe he's wearing them because there's psychological issues going on. So just, you know, paying attention to knowing who you're talking to and following the registry, following the listserv, and talking to people. I think, Liz, I think you were even talking earlier about the fact that we need to call people. We don't need to just assume that when we build a registry, people are going to just say, oh, that's exciting, you know, I'm going to, I can't wait till that announcement comes out, you know, and answer those 5,000 questions that Shelley thought were good. So you know, so you've got to call people and meet them where they are, make appointments. I found that you know, some people just, they don't have access to the internet, or maybe they don't understand the questions. So calling them up and asking them the questions and going through section by section really works well. So in the nonprofit world, we have to live up to a higher standard than the golden standard, which is, you know, do unto others as you would want to have done unto you. We must live up to the platinum standard, which is to do unto others as they would like to have done unto them. So we need to meet them where they are, and we need to be able, if we want something from them, we have to be able to give it to them give them what they need and the way they want to receive it. So this is another crazy image in my head. So starting a registry is a lot like becoming a parent. You don't know what you don't know, and maybe it's a good thing, or we'd never have a registry. So you say, oh, wow, you know, my kid craves salt, your kid craves salt, and these quirks start to become a trend, and so you think, let's start a registry. because that sounds like a really good idea. Well, back in 1998, we thought, oh, yeah, that sounds really good, but nothing existed. So we did it on Excel spreadsheets. And we started to, learn how to detail it on an Excel spreadsheet. And then we went from, what the registry was just beginning to come around. I think Megan was talking about back in the day when we were, in the Genetic Alliance, and we're saying we got to do registries, and really nothing really existed. So we began to benchmark other organizations and say, what are you doing? And lo and behold, none of the models worked, right? None of the models that we thought that we could copy from, like, can you give me that governance thing? There were no registries. So we got to start our very own model. So that was fun. Not so much did anybody ever say. But we went to the University of Florida, and it was an abstracted medical records and data that had been collected by physicians. That was really tough. I mean, because you have different people around the world, and different healthcare systems are unique, and they don't really like to just let go of medical records. But we did that for a while, and then we became a part of the pilot program of the GRDR, which is now NCATS, back in 2012. And this was even before we had the ICD code, which came around in 2015. So, once again, how difficult can a registry be? Kind of like sticking your head in the sandbox, right? So you think, everybody, you're a perfect parent till you have that first kid, and then you realize why the kids are screaming, and you're not really going to bless people out for all the cookie crumbs all over the kids' floor space when you go to a restaurant. So there's many different steps here, and none of them are, this is not necessarily in order. A lot of this is overlap. In between every single one of these steps, I would encourage you to go back to your people, go back to your board, make sure the people you serve are buying in on this process. This is their registry. It's not yours, it's theirs, and it's to serve them. And do you understand this? And getting them to understand, or making sure that what you're saying is said, they understand the questions. Going to other groups or making sure that the questions that you're asking are validated. That way they can be mapped to other organizations or other disease processes where you can compare what is this like next to another disease that might be similar to ours. Or making sure that your registry is portable, because as Steve was pointing out earlier, you have a registry platform and it's not portable and you're stuck with it. So you have a really cool thing that some guy created in a lab somewhere that can't be used anywhere. So you want to make sure that your registry database is portable, so if you go to a new vendor, you can take it with you. So the last thing, this is the baby, it was born. I thought it was kind of cute. So the last thing you want to consider is you want to consider these key things, and I'm hoping we will be able to share our slides, won't we, afterwards? So don't worry about all the details. But these are the 5 main things that I really want to stress. Scope and design. You want to make sure that when you're looking at this that you consider how many questions is too many questions, how much is really going to get people fatigued. So if you have 500 questions, people are not going to sit down in one sitting and do it. They have a life. You've got to be cognizant of this. You want to understand if you're going to want to link biospecimens to this and how you're going to do that and what the identification process is going to be. Who owns the data? Who owns it? And what is control? Do you want control over it, ownership over it? And really you need to have a deep discussion about what ownership and what control means to your organization. Because once you let it go, you can't get it back. So you really need to guard your data, your biological specimens, and you want to make sure that you can link it. Portability, again, I can't say that enough. You want to make sure that if you don't like the vendor or you've outsourced or you've outgrown the vendor, so you can take the data and you can take it to a new vendor, or just make sure that you can get it and take it with you, and that those IDs are able to go with you as well.
Well, and I think with portability as well, when you started all of this, there weren't a lot of vendors, and now we have vendors. Mm-hmm. Some vendors start and they don't continue.
Right.
Sometimes they get sold, someone else takes them over, there's mergers. So in addition to the portability, what happens to the data? And all of that should be in the contract. Mm-hmm. And that's so important. And can someone else buy the data? Or if that vendor gets sold, then where does that data go? So in addition to you taking it, thinking about it from the vendor sustainability as well.
That's a good point, because I don't think you think about moving, you don't necessarily think about the vendor moving. And again, it goes back to you don't know what you don't know until it happens. And then when it happens, it's scary. It's actually terrifying, because you think you've done everything you possibly can, and you've put your trust on the line for the people that you serve and said, please do this. And something that is out of your control has happened. Yeah. It's pretty scary. Compliance and safeguards, I think, are there redundant systems? When I went to, years ago, I went to an emergency preparedness meeting, and it was following Katrina. And what happened, it was staggering. Katrina was so large that the systems the newborn screening systems required that they be 50 miles apart for the redundant systems. Katrina was so big that it wiped out the primary and the redundant systems in the state of Louisiana. And none of the newborn screening would have been available had it not been for an OCD PI who was involved, who happened to have the data on his laptop. Probably shouldn't have done it, best practice, but he saved a lot of lives that way. But things along those lines, ask about redundant systems and backups, and are you going to get it, and de-identified data, and who's going to see the data, who's going to analyze the data, who's your team, who's going to be your bioethics person, who's going to be your biostatistician, and who's going to analyze it, and are they qualified to analyze it? So governance is complicated. This is kind of a word cloud, and these are the words that typically come up, or when you think of governance and oversight, this is the word cloud, but it always comes down to privacy and protecting the privacy of the individuals and making sure that the data is used properly, conflicts are considered, but privacy, privacy, privacy. And I'm not going to really go over this, but this will be in the slide. And this is how the Open Data Institute defines data trust and the different roles of people who are involved in a data trust, and that'll be in the slide. Finally, lastly, which I was mentioning a little bit earlier, I think that I have seen so many medical or journal articles where some really good science has been reported. And there's a lot of science that has been done where there are failures and it hasn't been reported. We need to have that come back to us. I think that was, we talked, Megan, you mentioned this earlier, some of the best science can be also the failures. Maybe you got the wrong endpoint, but we need that data back, because that can save time and that can save lives, and let's feed it back. And the way to do it, in my mind, when I'm the queen for the day, is to have a GUID that will be a unique identifier that will bring it all back in. And if I had it my way, I would go back to every investigator who has ever written a paper that was anywhere close to birth syndrome and figure out a way for us to be able to reconsent those people so we could get the data, know who they are, and have a longitudinal data and a natural history on them. Again, biobanks, what are you going to keep? There have been many biobanks where they say, oh, we want your liver, we want your brain, we want whatever, and nobody ever uses it. And to me, that is a sin. I have been on the phone with a parent of a child who has to be taken out of their arms to have an autopsy done where tissues are taken. And to me, the worst thing in the world would be to know that I put that parent through that pain and those tissues are not being used. So make sure that before you make the ask, you're going to use that information and you're going to use those biological specimens. And once you start it, you got to be able to keep it. This is your baby, and you have an ethical duty to continue it on. So I have a few references here, which you can, when you get the slides, including the damn map, you can look it up. But thank you. Who goes next? Finley.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley.
Hi, I'm Emily Milligan. Shelley is a tough act to follow. I hope you all had some coffee or something. I don't know who got the short end of the stick, but it appears that it was us for the 3:30 slot. I hope you're caffeinated for this. It's really an honor to be an executive director of an ultra-rare disease, particularly because I don't have children who are affected by this. So the fact that Shelley entrusts me to be here alongside her means a lot to me. And even though I don't have children of my own who are affected by BARTH, I do have 200 kids now. And my first identity always is being a mom. And so I really feel it when Shelley narrates, and other families do as well, the experience they've gone through, particularly when it comes to registry or even a loss of a child. So Shelley introduced us to the idea that a registry is almost like a baby, right? You get it, you think, oh, I've figured this out. But really, it will evolve as your organization evolves. Barr Syndrome Foundation has evolved over the last 20 years. We'll be 20 in 2020. We're really enjoying that marketing idea right now for a logo. But that is a testament to our Seed Grant program, to the relationships we've built with researchers around the globe. And one day you'll wake up and you'll say, now what? Because you thought you figured out your registry, and then you realize you have needs that you haven't accounted for in your registry. And so I wanted to use this as a case study here. Barr syndrome, we have a therapeutic pipeline now of roughly 5 potential clinical candidates, and one who we hope will eventually make it to FDA approval. Don't know, but we have another that's also in the clinic, so we have 2 clinical trials. And then we have others that are in preclinical or late-stage preclinical. But this is a changing landscape because, ask us 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, a clinical trial was something we wouldn't have thought of. We were so far from that. So how could we plan for preparing a registry for a clinical trial at that point? To Shelley's point, you don't know what you don't know. And so using us as a case study and kind of just, how I approach really complex problems, and registries are not easy. There's nothing easy. There's no easy in registry, right? It might rhyme, but it is very complicated. But you got to solve the problem. So think about it kind of in algebra, right? Or really basic. You have the discovery aspect of your basic research, and that's kind of the red there. The development side, when you're moving into pre-IND or an IND-enabling studies, as well as clinical trials. And then you get to access. And thinking red, orange, green. And it looks linear and very logical. Well, it's not. And so you've got discovery, development, and access. And I put a circle here and kind of continuous process for a reason, which I'll highlight in a moment. But the discovery phase, when you're thinking of your registry, the goal of your registry at that point in time is really going to be to catalyze your research program and stimulate interest in your disease, also by characterizing your disease. And we use it commonly for hypothesis generating in that stage. Again, you're bringing in the researchers. And then feeding on what you had said earlier, the quirks from the trends. Is it just one kid that likes salt, or is it 10 kids? And boy, maybe we should look into that. As you approach development stage, the goal of your registry does change a little bit, right? And this can all be simultaneous because programs are not just sequential. But development, you're going to de-risk the clinical development piece of that. And that means being able to recruit for your clinical trials, being able to engage with pharma and biotech and design a well-thought-out, patient-centric trial and that design, and then also engaging your community, making sure they understand what that therapy is and what that process will be like. And so that's a really important piece in that stage of development. And if you're successful going through the clinical trial phase, then you have access, right? When you're engaging regulatory and payers. So you've got everybody across the R&D continuum, every single constituency or stakeholder that you could possibly touch, a registry could be useful for engaging them. And to what Steve spoke earlier about their TSA's patient-focused drug development meeting. Barr Syndrome Foundation had ours last year also, and we were the first organization to do it outside of the DC area because one of our key values is patient centricity. That means centered around the patient. And so we had FDA come to us.
So where did they go?
They go to the beach.
So our biennial conference is in Florida.
Okay.
In July. It's cheap, and
It's so nice.
and it's very nice. You got a lot of availability in hotels, and
Kids like pools.
Kids have pools, lots
Yeah.
of AC. Occasionally there can be a hurricane, but that's a whole other story. And the other good thing was, and I have a slide on our, I have a slide on our PFDD, which is not in here, but thanks to Google, it shows you how much it costs to fly to Florida from DC in July, which I think was like $100 one way. So for $100 for FDA to come one way, $200 total, boy, that's a good gig. And it really was also helpful because we had a captive audience there. We had 25% of our world population, of our affected population, was there on site. And so while we were in Florida, we were kind of on an island, and so we, I think, exercised a little bit of peer pressure. Everybody, 100% participation, and it was a very successful event. But what came of that then was the Voice of the Patient report. Again, Steve spoke to that in his presentation prior. And the methods of a PFDD meeting, I think, would not qualify for a publication in a research journal, right? It's very important. It could be good for a white paper, but there's just certain methods that are helpful to validate the outcomes when you have your registry. You can say, we know for a fact that 2/3 of people have cardiac function issues because our registry told us, and also we heard about that in the polling of the PFDD. And then health economics. You go through this whole process, and then you have to figure out, well, who's going to pay for it, right? And it's very, very important, particularly when, for us, we don't even have a drug on the market. So everything's incremental to payers. So you have to build that business case about the cost of the system. And if you don't have a registry, then you're going to be using a whole other study alongside. So this is just a helpful tool to engaging a really key constituent.
And you both talked about things changing over time. So in some ways, you're not going to build all of this from the get-go.
No.
Because that's going to be really hard and feel like too much of a heavy lift. But
She did let me just say this, I gotta just give her a shout out. The woman volunteered before we hired her, right? She volunteered for us after she took the job to help us make a success of the PFDD meeting. And with 39 days under her belt on the job, led an extremely successful meeting. So I've just gotta say
It's a we.
that's not
It's a
for
we.
cowards.
But I think just remember, a lot of this can be iterative, and we talked about the PDSA model, and you can add things on, and that's what's nice about being able to be nimble, and you don't have to have this all set up at the very beginning, because you don't know what you don't know, right? So it'd be, if you knew all of that, it would be easy.
So my advice would be, look in the mirror, figure out where you are right now with your research programs, and then start planning 3 to 5 years out. If you're planning 10 years out or more, likely you do not have the resources to do everything we just talked about, and your research program will suffer because of that. So you do have to do it slightly incrementally, but planning a little ways out, but realistically, and I'll speak to that in a second. Go a little bit faster this, but there are different types of registries. You talk to one person, they'll use the word. You talk to another person, they'll say registry, and they mean something completely different. There's a lot of animals in the zoo. So ask for clarity when you're talking about a registry so you understand the type of data that people are collecting because it's different. You have PROs, which are the patient-reported outcomes, and caregiver outcomes, not to forget the caregivers. And then you also have, when you're doing more research elements, where you're collecting the EMR data and the clinical outputs. And then you have natural history studies, which are under a master protocol and with follow-up and frequent visits. All of these have very different price points. The other question, so you've talked about what kind of goals do you have for your registry? Okay, what kind of data do you need in order to support those goals? Okay, and let's put it into action. Rubber hits the road. You're going to start getting the data, the data generating part. This can be really tough if you're not actively engaging with your community. So many times you'll see organizations put all their eggs in stage 1. They forget all about stage 2 or stage 3. And you are not going to maximize an ROI on your registry unless you are intentionally going through an analytical process. And that depends on, do you have longitudinal data? How is your data structured? You're commonly going to have to require a biostatistician to help out. So you have to think through the resources to support each of these different stages. Otherwise, you're going to have a database that may not have currency, right? Because it doesn't render any value to the landscape unless you get it through these different stages. And by marketing, real quickly, it's basically telling people what you learned. Right? That can be in the form of scientific literature, it can be in the form of a white paper, it can be like in our annual report where we actually highlight the different things we've learned from our registry and telling our community about that. So just
And
getting
I
the
think
word
that's
out.
really important to get them engaged, right? Because if they're filling out surveys and they're part of this, they want to, when we do things, we all want to know what's happening with the information, what's happening with the data. And I think John showed a picture this morning, you know, Field of Dreams, if you build it, he will come. Well, that's not how it works. So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah. It's particularly important if there's not organically interest in your indication.
Yeah.
Like sickle cell, I know they've got people knocking down their doors, and they're trying to catch up many times with registry in some of the different organizations. So depends on where the market is. If you're trying to stimulate a market, you're going to have to go through these steps. And then this is something I did and just trying to think, like break this all down. What does this mean? How much should I be putting into my registry in way of resources? We are capital limited, as are probably all of you, right? Maybe different denominators. But I went through and asked many different organizations, what's your annual budget? How much are you spending on your registry? You know, broad strokes. Don't crunch numbers at night. Just tell me roughly what you're spending.
So were they open and willing to help you?
Very much so. Ask the questions, get people on the phone. They're happy to help. Because I think nobody wants, there's no reason for you to have to go through a learning curve that many others have already tread there before. And then the punchline really is that we found, and I recognize not everybody has $1.5 million budget, right? But of organizations of that size, and recognizing denominators are different, right? That 3 to 5% of an organization operating budget really needs to be spent on a registry if you're hoping to get any of that ROI out of it. That's not even necessarily including the personnel piece of it. People commonly will say, oh, let's do a registry. And they want you to do it off the side of your desk. So I wink at my friend here. And that's just not feasible. You're not going to be able to approach it as a strategic resource for your organization unless you have some FTE or consultant work associated with that. Now, there are ways to offset that and underwrite it with the support of other organizations. Last but not least, the market is, in my humble opinion, quite saturated right now. And there's a lot of competitors. I think some will perish, some will thrive. And we're trying to figure out who's going to really be the best platform for us. So I can't necessarily say like one is better than the other. And really, if you were to ask me what would be best for your organization, I can't tell you. You've got to go through that process of saying, where are we with our research? What are our strategic priorities? And then figure out what type of data you want to be collecting in order to support that. That is often a board conversation, engaging at a strategic level. And then that will point you to a platform that will support those objectives.
So Emily, you're doing a fantastic job setting Sonia up for how they went through this process. But I want to pause right here on this slide to just let you know in the workbook, what we wanted to do is we wanted to provide a list of potential vendors because we didn't want everyone to have to go out and try to find the vendors themselves. But please know this list is not inclusive. These materials are going to be living, but there will be new organizations that come on. Some of those organizations may fall off. So just take that with a grain of salt. This isn't completely inclusive, but we wanted to give you a starting place. And Sonia, this is, and I just wanted to make another quick point about budget. When you look at that slide, you see a lot of different operating budgets for the organization. You see a lot of different amounts for the registry. I mean, there is a huge range. So don't think, oh, I don't have $5 million, I can't do this. And I would just say, think about human resources too, because when we think about cost expended, we're really good about thinking the checks we have to write, but we don't think about people's time. And I think time is one of our most valuable assets that's underappreciated. So I'm going to turn it over to Sonia.
Sure, and I'll be fairly brief. the reason I'm on this panel is I'm someone who loves process. I love thinking about how do you do a process, and we ran a conversation, and I started talking about how when the Epilepsy Foundation, we're doing all these different data collections, and I came on board, I was like, what's the process? Like, why did you choose this person and not another person? And so when we started to think about how do we sync all these data initiatives together, I got to step in and be a little bossy and come up with something, which I'm not saying is the only way to do it, but can be a guidepost. So I think these are my old slides. I used to have really nice cartoons, but that's fine. I can do these old slides. So I had step one, which was to create a data technology advisory group. So basically, I am not a health informatics specialist. I'm someone who can understand data. I like to research, but I don't think about data architecture all the time, and I recognize that. There are people in your community that probably do have that expertise. I'm really fortunate because the Epilepsy Foundation touches so many people, and so we could really use the talent pool that way. But even people outside the epilepsy space wanted to get involved. And so when I was thinking about my data technology advisory group, I wanted to make sure I had data informatics people. I wanted to make sure I had clinicians, since they're going to be using it. I wanted to make sure I had foundation leadership. And most importantly, I wanted to make sure that people impacted by epilepsy, the people that are going to be contributing the data, were also part of that advisory group. And when I got the advisory group together, the first call was really thinking about, okay, what are our priorities? Because it would be great to spend $50 million that we don't have and create this amazing thing. But as we build out in a modular fashion, so what's that low-hanging fruit? One. Two, when we draft our request for proposals, what do we need to make sure that we're looking for? What would you be thinking about? And three, would you help us evaluate those bids and provide those recommendations? And so that's why I created this advisory group, and it got to 15 people. I usually don't like them to get so big, but it was a really fruitful conversation in the sense that there was a clear purpose. They had 3 things that they needed to do. I was driving the documentation and sort of putting out the proposals and getting feedback that way. So I took the lead on that, and if you are going to do it this way, you will need to have that time allocated to make sure that you are driving that conversation to make sure it's successful. So once I created the advisory group and I sort of went through, we had the patient experience, clinician experience, research experience, data platform experience. I was looking for people that both had industry experience and academic. It was really hard to find somebody that would not present a conflict of interest and not want to also apply to be a vendor. So it took actually a long time to figure that out. But through the grapevine, one of the places that you can think about are people that are retired. So that might have that industry expertise, but they don't have a claim anymore to make, and so they might be able to be a little bit more impartial, as well as the foundation leadership. And so once we did that, we created this RFP, and what we decided to do was, we had no idea how many RFPs were going to come to us. We ended up getting 9 coming in, but we decided that for each reviewer, there would be 4 people on that review, that everyone should read all the bids, but they would be the ones that would be representing it, and each of those 4 had to be from those different stakeholder groups to provide that representation.
So did you have them sign like a conflict of interest form? Or
yes.
How did you handle that?
And you can sort of see that. So in the Appendix D, I have my platform critique form that you can certainly plagiarize as much as you like. Basically, we had a conflict of interest form that they had to sign for the vendors. And if there was a conflict of interest, explain what it was. When that vendor was being reviewed, they would step off the call. As well as we had a non-disclosure agreement to make sure that that was also above board. And you can look at the example too. I think it's page 49 in the workbook. But basically, what the review form was the checklist of requirements that we brainstormed with the DTAG team. There was a section where people rated the technical capabilities as they understood them, the credibility of the vendor, and the customer satisfaction. References are so important. We asked everyone to provide at least 3 references. Even before the review, I called up all the references. It actually helped inform us and brought up issues that we might not have been thinking about. So I really think that that's a useful way for you to sort of grow your network and figure out what's going on in the space. We wanted people to also rate it on process and workflow. We want to make sure that it's very clear how their team is going to be working, as well as the responsive design. How do they mid-course correct? How are they going to deal with the situation if they go out of business? How are they going to deal with the situation if we don't want their business? So really making sure that that's outlined in the RFP, and then there was this sort of wild card other that people could write in as well. And so out of those 9 bids, we decided to select 2 to come back, and then we had those 2 finalists do a demo for us. So we basically said, you have a sense of what this is going to be like. It's going to be an in-person meeting. Can you provide a demo for the capabilities of your platform? And we can have that in-person meeting.
So with your data advisory group, and you were reviewing the applications, did you do that by phone?
We did that by video teleconferencing technology, so we could see the person really left the room, and then I would text them to say they could come back on. So yeah, because we wanted to keep it cheaper, but we had people all across the country. And something that I've learned is when you give a group a really clear objective, they know when they're meeting, they know what's expected of them, they really step up. And I think that when there's a very defined time that you're asking people to volunteer a lot of time, and they know what the output is, you can actually be really pleasantly surprised. And I was really, really pleasantly surprised how seriously everyone took these reviews, how efficient the review process was, and also what I had done. I don't know if it's not in here. So in the other slides that I had that hopefully will get sent out into the group was, and it's in the appendix, you can sort of see the rating criteria that we did. So before the review, I sent out, this looks like what the rating criteria is. Let's start at the bottom so we figure out what our baseline is and work our way up, because it could be that when we talk about these weaknesses, we realize they're in the other ones that people had also rated really highly. And out of the top 2 finalists, one of those, if you just looked at the rankings before the review discussion, wouldn't have made it in the top 2. So that's also something really important to keep in mind, that discussion is also really critical.
So when you had them do the demo, you had the demo in person, was it to all 15 people that were on your, how did you handle that?
Yeah, so for the demo, it was a little bit different because we were thinking that that's really a foundation leadership decision. So we expanded who in foundation leadership would be there, as well as making sure that the different stakeholder groups were represented, but it wasn't all 15.
And how did you communicate to the stakeholder groups? I mean, because now you're moving into something that's really a foundation decision. It's operational. The foundation is going to be the one that's going to be expending the money. How did you communicate that to your advisory group, and how did that go?
The advisory group was fine with it. I mean, it was something up front. We weren't asking the advisory group to contribute money for this. We were saying, we want you to help us make this decision. We want it to be an informed decision. But after we had the demos, we sort of let them talk about it. At the end of the day, they selected the top 2, and we got to pick between the 2. So they were happy with the top 2. I think it might have been a different situation if we had really split dissent and those top 2, and we might have handled it a little bit differently if people were like, I can only live with this one and not the other one. Then we might have thought about it. But I think the 2 that ended up being at the top were very different types of vendors. One was more of a smaller company customized type of vendor, and the other was sort of a very big, has been around the block for a really long time. And it was really interesting when they did their demos, their styles were also very different. And so you also want to think about what fits with your culture as well when you're doing these demos, because that would not have come across in what's written on paper, because you can write anything on paper, right? So I really highly recommend that when you make this important decision that you do that as well.
So what else really surprised you about going through the process?
I think that, so the person we actually ended up selecting was not somebody that was even on our radar out of the 9. So that really surprised me, because sort of we thought we knew what we knew, and then we realized we didn't. I think also when you read 9 of them in a row, you realize on the other end sort of who put thought into it. You can sort of tell who's really trying, and that really comes out on paper. So I teach, and I often can tell who's BSing, and I'm always surprised because I know as a student I thought that I was like really savvy when I was BSing, and it's clearly not the case, because I can spot it. And I think that when you are requiring people to put down in paper what they're doing, it's easy to sometimes pick that out. That's not the only thing that you need to be thinking about, but it's so critical to have them lay out what they say they're going to do. How are they going to deal with these issues? The other thing was we weren't sure about the budget. So this is sort of a chicken and egg situation, right? Where we want to go to our board and we want to say, hey, can you approve X amount of dollars? But we don't know what those X amount of dollars are going to cost. We also want to get a good deal, right? And we don't know what the good deal is as well. So one of the things that we did, and I don't know if this is necessarily the best way to go about it, but we didn't put a number for our stuff. So we basically just said, you tell us what you think the budget is going to be, and we'll go from there, and that'll be the starting point of negotiations. And so that was also really interesting to see, because even though there was a range, it all sort of centered around one number, and so we got a sense of, okay, this is how much it's actually going to cost. So it's like a really easy way for us to do this landscape assessment without having to do the work ourselves.
Well, and I think if you would have put a number, everyone would have come in at that number.
Exactly. So if I had said we had $1 million, everyone would have magically have $1 million. If I said we had 100K, they would have figured something out. So that's also, I think, really, really key. I know that for our RFP, and I am happy to share it too, I got a lot of feedback from the vendors that they felt like it was very clear what we were asking. And I think that also had a lot to do with the fact that there were 15 people reviewing it with 15 different perspectives. So I had written out the RFP, and then I sent it out to the group, and there was just that Google Doc, multiple reiteration. Language is so critical. The way that a patient advocacy organization talks is very different than how an industry person talks, is very different from how a clinical person talks. And so making sure that you get that language right, especially to your point that there's so many different registries, is critical for that. So the tips that I would say for vendor selection is, learn from other advocacy organizations, interview potential vendors, and also the references. This is not my slides, so
I know, it's
I'm
my
reading
slide.
It really
It's totally fine, just go for it.
So basically, I'm going off these slides.
But this is in the workbook, so we had a little slide glitch.
I'm just on a roll. I was thrown off because the slides I just did were also not my slides. I had really beautiful animations, and
You rolled with it. I'm impressed.
it's been a long day. So talk to your current and former clients.
Let's see what they're doing next to you. Come on.
So this is the last slide. You're doing great.
The customization is going to be really key, and prioritize. And actually, this last point is really critical about what's nice to have. So we sort of talk about must-haves and nice-to-haves. And so when we first had our first DTAG call, we threw everything on there, and the list was super, super long. And then we had to be like, okay, so now let's do a reality check and say, what do we absolutely need to do? And when we were thinking about our data platform, we said, okay, for our proof of concept, we need to prove that we can merge at least 2 data sets together. Let's just start really basic, and that provides value. Okay, if that's all we want to do for our first one, what are the best data sets that we might want to merge, and what is it that we want to show that we can provide value, and go from there.
And this is on page 26 in the workbook. So I did have a couple more questions for you. So where are you in the process now?
So we selected a vendor, and then we have the fun part of the legal agreements where you get, it's fun. So there's a master services agreement that we had to look at. You had to look at a hosting services agreement as well as a maintenance service agreement. So in addition to them actually doing the work, how much does it cost for them to actually host it year to year, and how much to maintain it. So those are separate costs. We also then, what we decided to do was before we wrote out a scope of work, we wanted to make sure that it was really clear with the vendor what we wanted to do. And since we were in the position that we weren't sure what we wanted to do, we just wanted to create something better for our own organization. We hosted a workshop where we brought our preferred technology vendors to the workshop. We had 40 people in the room, again representing different stakeholder groups. We were really focusing on people that already had databases in the epilepsy space or were and really actively involved in that area. And I basically looked at design thinking. So I was Googling Amazon School of Thought of how they do design thinking. And one of the ways that they do design thinking is they work backwards, and they want you to write a press release before you actually create the product. So I made everyone in the room write a press release that you would want to submit with your fake customer quote, about what you would want to say about the data platform. And I wanted our preferred vendors in the room so that they were really clear that this is where we wanted to go. And it was only after that workshop that we can now start negotiating the scope of work, because everyone sort of has this vision statement. And so for that scope of work, we've set up a series of workshops for that first phase. One is sort of thinking about the data assets that we actually now are going to do in that scope of work, thinking about how that data is going to be validated to make sure that, when someone comes to us and says, we're not sure about this patient-reported outcome data, what are we going to do with that? Also thinking about the governance and consent component, and then, most importantly, business operations. How is this going to be financially sustainable? Because our board made it very clear, you don't have that sustainability plan, you can do this proof of concept, but that's where the proof of concept will end. And so our vendors been very flexible in working with us, and they're really excited about it because as we talk about business operations, they might have had their own reasons for why they submitted the bid, right? And their own reasons might have their own strategic partners. And when you're really transparent and saying, this is how much money we have up front, we would love to spend X amount of dollars, but for this proof of concept, we can only spend so much. When you have a very willing partner, you can learn new things about that partner and make it work. Transparency is really key in those relationships.
And it sounds like organizational fit was really important for this project. It wasn't just, I'm just going to pick a vendor and it's going to work. You needed someone that was going to be willing to grow with you.
Yeah, and I think that that's not always the case, right? If you have a really clear assignment of what you want to do, there could be the perfect vendor that's out there. Here, the Epilepsy Foundation has toyed with a lot of different data, and we wanted to create an overarching data infrastructure that brought all those data assets together. And so with that plug-and-play approach, there were a lot of different ways that we could do our proof of concept, and that's why we were more interested in someone who is willing to have growing pains with us along the way.
No, this was wonderful. So we're going to want to open it up to questions. I know that, and we're going to be up here for the next Q&A as well, but I know you're going to have to leave. So I would suggest if there are questions for Sonia that we kind of bump them closer to the top. And I think one thing about your experience and your process, a lot of that can be applicable to anyone trying to make a decision about what vendor to use. And you can pick people to help make that decision. You maybe don't need 15 people, but the different stakeholder groups I think were really valuable, and there's so many things from what you've done that you could apply to so many different situations, and it's a wonderful roadmap.
I do have a couple of questions specific for Sonia, but did you want to mention that?
Oh, yes. Yes, well, yes. So, and there's a lot of stuff in the back of the workbook. So in addition, on page 48 to the Epilepsy Foundation's platform critique form, there's also a lot of, before you get to that point, just general questions to ask vendors, starting on page 46. And again, not all of these will apply to your situation. We just tried to kind of throw the whole kitchen sink at you, and then you could just figure out which ones made the most sense. Because all of this, there are a lot of commonalities, but so much of this ends up being individualized based on the question you're trying to ask and what you are trying to do in your specific community.
So the specific questions, Sonia, are how long did the vendor selection process take? How many people were involved in the decision-making process? You might have answered that one, right?
Yeah, so there were 15 people on the Data Technology Advisory Group that we had. And so the process, So I just have to sort of think about when we first had it. So we started having meetings in the late fall, in September, October, with the Data Technology Advisory Group, and that probably took 2 months to sort of figure out what the RFP was going to look like, just to make sure that we got that feedback. And then we released the RFP, and I went on maternity leave, and so that might have extended the process a little bit longer. And so for the first, and so people had the RFP out for 3 months, and they could then submit. One of the other things that we did that I didn't mention here is that we allowed midway through the open process for a time for people to ask questions. And so we would then respond to those answers by a certain deadline, and we would send those responses to all the people that had reached out, that had questions, to be very transparent that we weren't just talking to one vendor. So whenever a vendor reached out to us and said, this RFP question isn't clear, and we knew who else was responding, we then emailed everyone to say, just so you know, this was a question that had come out. So once that had happened, we gave 3 weeks for the reviewers to then do the review, and then a month for the demo to happen.
Okay, great, thank you. Maybe we can excuse you and move into our last session. Thank you, Sonia. You get the improv award for the conference.
Thank you.
Do we want to bring any other panelists in the area? Well, I'll ask these questions, and I guess maybe you could stand up if they're more relevant for you. So these maybe are for this panel. How do we engage community when patients have a very difficult time understanding even the basic science behind our disease?
I'll expand to that.
I think that, again, it's really important to meet people where they are. I think it's our job to make them their own best advocate. And my goal is to, within a year, to take somebody from tears to advocacy. So I think participating in the registry, I have found, has been extremely helpful in having the moms, the apron strings for somebody to go from being an infant or being treated like an infant when they're 18 and understanding their own condition. So they've ultimately got to walk into the doctor's office and talk about themselves. So for the older people that are, that mom has done the talking most of their lives, they have found the registry to be very empowering and teaching them more about their condition. And I think the same is true to take somebody who only understands the basics. I think you've got to translate it for them.
Okay. Anyone in the audience?
So our organization's really small, and I've got a question about managing the data once we get it and who has access to it. Is there any type of training that you reckon? Because we're volunteers and parents, so access to that data once it's there, and even entering it into different systems. Is there any sort of training you could recommend that people should take before we give them access to do that?
So typically people that are working with data on the organizational side have CITI training, and I can't remember, it's CITI, and it's an ethical training, it's online. The NIH has also had a version of it. In one of our groups, we actually ended up getting an institutional license to the CITI training, so more people could have access to it, and that's a good place to start, but that's something that you can put in your governance policy, that people that are, people within the organization that have access to the data will only use it for the appropriate things that they have access for, and here's what they're required to do to have access.
Okay.
The other thing is, usually with an IRB, you'll have to list key personnel.
Yeah.
So you just can't say, oh yeah, help us analyze this data. It has to be HIPAA compliant, so make sure you follow those processes.
Right, and so the PI is obviously going to have CITI training, and you might have coordinators, and some of those might be volunteers. A lot of parents started out as coordinators, and then they've kind of moved on to staff. So we can definitely answer some of those questions offline.
Okay, thanks.
Just to that point, I was just going to say that we started out as parent volunteers, and the CITI training was, it's online and it's important. CITI training, CITI. NIH had a free version, and I don't think it's offered anymore, but it may be. But we weren't thinking, when people said, how much does it cost to start a registry, we thought about the bill from the vendor. Again, we were not thinking what our volunteer hours were. So when we finally were like, we have to take care of our sick kids, let's raise more money to hire somebody, we didn't really calculate all the hours that we as volunteers were giving and what that was going to equate to for a genetic counselor. So track what you're doing, because there's a price tag on it. And it was not something that we were budgeting for. And I was very relieved to get out of the role of seeing people's genetic reports. And through our governance, I was allowed to, because I had city training and I had rules and regulations and things to go by. But it was a great relief to move to that next stage of having a genetic counselor curating our reports. And things can be done part-time. In terms of analysis, I've heard lots of very creative ways. Some registries have partnered with universities in terms of this becomes part of the coursework, and some of the students do some analysis. Also, getting a postdoc and saying, we got all this data, and make this your dissertation. So there is creative ways of doing it in the beginning. And again, it's a great thing to crowdsource, ask people about.
Oh, and the link to city training is in the back of the workbook. Since we're getting ready to transition into the larger Q&A, I'm wondering if Megan and Steve and Terry could come up as well, and we could just sit you guys next to each other and share a handheld.
Thank you. So
Shelley, you might need to move.
we
to
have
the others.
a couple more
You might need to move to the
questions here that are relevant. Well, they're probably relevant for everyone. How do we capture the patient voice? This question is about considering the data registry platform. How do we capture the patient voice when a disease community is new and information is lacking?
No, you're fine, yeah.
Anyone have an opinion on that? So how do you even get started capturing the patient voice when there's not much known about the disease?
So Steve might have a different thought on this. I mean, it's kind of your talk, but from our experience you can convene focus groups, right? If you can at least have a critical mass to get in one room and ask the questions, a lot can emerge from that process. I would say that's probably one of the first steps if you don't have a lot known about your disease. Now, Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd say if there's, quote unquote, not a lot known, that then the patients or the parents are actually the ones who know the most about the disease. So I think it's actually more critical to get together at that time and talk about what are the experiences, think about how you would document it. You could start very rudimentary with a registry of, just start from scratch. But you guys are then actually the experts, right? You know more about the disease than anybody else, and that could serve as the launching point to get everything else started.
One thing I wanted to add to that too is, bringing the patients together at some type of family conference, something that you can do that you can unite the community. Look parallel to your syndrome and possibly determine what scientist or researcher is working possibly in a space to a sister disease and be able to invite them to be with you. We didn't have a lot that was known for the glycoprotein storage diseases back in 2004 when IRSMRD started. These are the ultra-orphan diseases. But by us teaming up with some scientists and researchers that were in research related to the diseases, we were able to gather this very rare group of ultra diseases to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we actually ended up writing a grant and funded an international natural history study. But it was because of all of the information that these parents had. They knew the diseases the best. We just had to connect the dots and bring them together.
Great, thank you. How do you create a patient platform if your organization takes into account all rare diseases? Should we make separate platforms for each category of disease? I don't know if that's by state or by nation, maybe.
Well, I'll take first go at this. since we're an umbrella organization and we are working with a number of groups internationally, we didn't need to have a separate platform for each group. What we're looking at, though, is some redesign, and we are, as I had mentioned before, it's important to audit the systems that you have for your registries, what's working, what's not, based on what research is evolving, what answers are we not receiving because we didn't know that we needed to have them 3 years ago. And so a lot of the information may be translational across diseases, some of them may not, and so we're looking to be able to have separate question responses based on syndrome, but not a different platform.
This is not an answer, but it's related, and that is, especially if you're a newly identified disease group, don't reinvent the wheel, and I can't say collaboration enough. Look for other diseases. If you're an autoimmune disease, look to the other autoimmune diseases and see if you can get on the same platform as they are. See if you can use as many questions as possible. Reach out to those autoimmune researchers that are already, embedded in these other diseases that might, also cross over to you. It may be between two vendors, but if one vendor doesn't have related diseases on it and the other one has 3 diseases that are similar to yours, in the end, that might be the vendor you go with because of cross disease. Dr. Chris Dawson said at a recent rare disease meeting, with 7,000 to 8,000 rare diseases, we are not going to find a treatment one disease at a time. And at the rate we're going, it's going to take 2,000 years. So it is imperative that you find other diseases that look and act like yours to work with. And it may be, we work with TS on things that are autism related, and we work with them on things that are epilepsy related. And there's all sorts of different ways you can collaborate, but by no means, especially in the rare disease community, do you have to do any of this alone.
Good job.
Applause.
But I'll just add one thing to that. It's hard to follow that. Good job. The other thing is, we are clearly not an umbrella organization. We are part of one, but we have our own registry. And I can speak about the specificity of Barth syndrome because it's very heterogeneous in way of symptoms as well as severity. And you might see over time that there's genotypic and phenotypic variability within your population. They may have different experiences, such as transplants. So your registry does have to be versatile, but yet be able to speak to different experiences across your population, even if it's within one disease.
So that actually brings up another question. We have a question about the Barth syndrome platform. Which vendor did you select?
Which time?
Lots.
Excel. So the first time when we were doing the abstracted data, we used it was a made-up version, which was out of University of Florida, and it was kind of piggybacked to Megan's point. It was piggybacked on Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So it was a little less expensive because it was, it had already been partially funded. But then we had to change because the investigator was leaving the University of Florida, and we heard about one of our board members had been volunteering on the rare disease initiative at the Office of Rare Diseases at the time, which is NCATS now. And we got involved with that, and so we got involved with Invitae and Patient Crossroads, and what was it before it was that? It was something. Analyst, yeah, and that. So there's been 3 iterations, and now it's Invitae. So, I think that the other thing that I'd like to say without getting anybody really upset, but why not bother? Okay, it's not the first time. So, I think you need to look and see periodically, is this the right fit? It's like at some point, if you're yelling at each other all the time, it's not really good for the kids, so you might want to consider getting a divorce. So I think that you need to look at the platform and say, does this fit anymore? I'm not fitting in a size 4 anymore. I might need new clothes. So we want to, I personally think that you need to plan that as well, to revisit those platforms. And there's no harm in leaving it. You just get very scared because you think, oh my God, not again.
Not again.
Well,
There
and
is
this
a
is
cost to it,
something
though.
you
Yeah, there is a
do
cost to
yearly
it.
with your governance review, right? We keep talking about audits, reviewing things. This is a dynamic space. Things are changing. You're getting new data. You might have new drugs that are going to be coming into the pipeline that, which is wonderful, but it's going to change what you need. And maybe your vendor, you can't collect the kinds of things you need to collect. So all of this is just evaluation and seeing if things meet your needs, and it's just part of the process, and you should just embrace it and do it yearly and see where you're at. And I think most people in the world are professional, and you realize if a relationship doesn't meet each other's needs anymore, it's okay to move on.
And the other thing is to be thinking about the future. We asked 300 questions, and it started out as Dr. Phelan asking questions at our 2-year conference in paper and pen, and then it moved to this registry. What about wearables? What about apps? I mean, should our next vendor be something that people are using their phones for? God help me, I hope that's not the only way we can collect it. But is there something that you should be thinking about like 5 years ahead of now, technology-wise? Another true confession while I'm up here is I thought IT was like all I needed to know. IT is not informatics at all. And both groups will be very offended if you refer to an informaticist as an IT person. I just know that because I've done it.
Way to make friends, Megan.
And it's bad. But one of the things we didn't know was when we had consultants helping us in the beginning, we didn't have informaticists who knew how the data was going to look at the end. So we had great questions, we thought. We got them from great people, other registries. But when the data came in and it was time to analyze it, it was a little messier than it could have been had we had somebody to help us with it. But at the time, we didn't have the money to hire somebody to help us with it. So I'm just saying there's really a lot of value in having the right mix of people advising you.
Well, and think creatively, because we think informatics and health informatics, but if you have someone in your organization, a parent, a board member that does market researchers know how to develop surveys. And there's an art form to asking the question to get data that comes out in a way that's meaningful. So my favorite, and I told this story last time, one of my favorite questions was this group that was like, okay, our premier advisor, who's a physician, has this question we have to ask. Do you have kidney or liver problems? Okay, so let's just unpack that. If I say yes, what does that mean? Do I have kidney problems? Do I have liver problems? Do I have both? I can't tell you the amount of time I spent on the phone trying to explain it needed to be 2 questions. Do you have kidney problems, yes or no? Do you have liver problems, yes or no? But they didn't want to offend their preeminent MD who knew a lot about patient care and the kidney and liver problems, but really didn't know questionnaire design. So it takes a village, and you need to find people and think creatively about find people to help you look at things. And there are a lot of us that have done a lot of these. Most of us probably will look at your questionnaire and be like, that question, that data, that's not gonna come out the way you want. And think about it too, you've probably done a SurveyMonkey, maybe about a conference or something just for your community, and then when you get the data back, you're like, oh, that really didn't do what I needed. So I think people will be really willing to help, but that's a very good point, informatics and questionnaire design expertise.
Check all that applies is a very messy thing on the other
Oh
hand.
yeah, what do you do with that? Or I don't know. That was one that because sometimes we just don't know family history. Do you have a family history of heart disease? Yes, no, I don't know. What does that mean if I say I don't know? Yeah.
And to somebody's point earlier about open text, one of the issues with it, there's a lot of issues with it, but one of the issues with it is that if it says, other, and I have open text, I might say, Shannon doesn't fall asleep well, and blah, blah, blah. Well, I've just put an identifier in there. That means somebody has to go back through all of people's open text answers and make sure there's no identifiers. And people like to use people's names because they think it's being helpful. So really resist that.
And that's the kind of thing, you can have that coming in, but you really have to be thoughtful about what data are going out that you're giving to researchers, because you can't give identifiers. So if I were to share that one that Shannon has problems sleeping, that would not be a good thing. So then it takes extra data cleaning on the back end.
You know, one of the things that was mentioned earlier is the immediate give back. You just answered all these questions, so here, voila, here you are. This is where you fit in the registry. For us, with birth syndrome, predominantly it affects males, and again, it does affect some females, but it's X-linked and skewed X inactivation. Females aren't affected, but we had a young man who finished the registry, and I hadn't had a chance to get to the registry. Somebody had answered the questionnaire like 7 times because English wasn't their first language. It all showed up. He got on the listserv and he says, I was not aware there were 12 females that had Barr syndrome. And everybody on the listserv was like, oh my God, there's a pocket of females. And it was the bad answer. It was just a bad answer. I hadn't had a chance to get to the person and to say, you only had to answer it once, and a carrier is not the same as an affected individual, you know? So it really, I'm not a great fan of immediate input. I think that they need to be validated. I think that the person has to be verified as having the diagnosis, because I think you're gonna really screw your data up, and I don't think it's gonna be doing anybody any favors. That's just my opinion.
That was actually a question asked here, which is, do you validate people, and at what stage?
We didn't in 2011 because people didn't self-diagnose, and with the internet now people do self-diagnose. So now we found out from our researchers that although we may have 1,300 people enrolled in our registry, we only have 600 genetic reports. They only want the data from those 600. And so we get on the phone and try and call the other people and say, what can we do to help you get your genetic report uploaded? In terms of getting back to governance, part of our governance is how are we going to maintain this throughout the year? And part of it is maintenance, it's cleaning. It's our genetic counselor going in and finding these errors that you were talking about. You know, how many people, check the box for male, and then it says age of onset for menstrual cycle, and there's an answer. Well, clearly something's wrong here, or a birth date in the future. So again, when you're thinking about budget, whether it's man hours or paying a genetic counselor, somebody needs to go in there and do regular maintenance. And if that's written into your governance, then it will get done. And if it doesn't, it will get shoved down the list.
Yeah, and I think that I just wanted to add on about the genetic counselor. Genetic counselors have a really important and wonderful skill set, but what we learned on the project with Megan is they really needed to be trained in that disease. And we had to work with a PhD level geneticist, because there's a bucket of information that's really straightforward, but then there was this other group that wasn't quite as straightforward. And we ended up spending a lot of investment training the genetic counselors so they actually could evaluate that disease. So just remember, even though they're genetic counselors, you might have to train them a little bit on the disease. And Terry, you had a comment.
It was a good segue into what I was going to just mention, and playing off something that was just said, was that designing a survey, we have to be considerate of the questions and how we're framing them. There is something called patient sensitivity and parent sensitivity to questions. However that looks in terms of how you develop the question for the survey, or perhaps however you open your survey up so that families will understand it isn't meant to be impersonal. They're about to embark on a journey that's very important, and the data that we're trying to extrapolate needs to be pure, and it needs to be centrally understood. And so, as we mentioned, the word, for instance, affected individual, and our patient population with the surveys, we engaged our now living adults that have MPS and ML, because we do have therapies, and so now our children are living into adulthood. Their input has been very valuable for us, and we literally have we've striked out affected individual off of our booklets, our publications, our educational materials. But where I'm going is there is a patient sensitivity there. And what I've learned today is we won't move forward unless we have a consultant for the second time. Someone that has informatics background is crucial for us. And I just won't move forward. If we decide to make a change in our platform, those two key things is what I've taken away today.
So that's actually a good segue. I would kind of wonder if we could go down the line, and Steve, I don't want to put you on the spot, but we could always start with Emily. So I'm going to put someone on the spot. So if you could just, like, what's the one or two big takeaways you want the people in the room and online to be thinking about? We've talked about a lot of stuff today, so what are your kind of key messages?
I think it's, kind of towards the answer of that question that came up earlier. You probably, know more than you think you do, and you're more of an expert than you might think you are. And I think we've heard a lot of commonalities today around, it's not personal. Don't be afraid to have a discussion with that researcher or that clinician that you think is an expert, but you're also an expert, and you're also a key opinion leader, and you should have that conversation and be confident, not personal and not derogatory and not negative, but it needs to be about the data. Take it to the data. Here's this piece of data that you have. Here's this piece of data that I have. Here's this, and I think the other thing is the access that you have as patient advocates to FDA and NIH and people who want to hear from you and are happy to talk to you and learn and respect where you're coming from. So I think I would take away a lot of confidence from those two things, that you're in a position to move forward and have those conversations, because you're the ones you're the leaders and the ones who know the most about where you're coming from.
I think I already mentioned my takeaways.
We'll say them again. I want to remember.
Yeah, a couple of things. There's a lot of teachable moments today, but a couple of things that I realized for the patients and for our mission and for the society is that if we decide to make a change in our platform, if we go through the audit process this summer and determine that this is not where we're going to stay, we won't move forward without a consultant. We won't move forward without someone that truly understands informatics and what we're trying to achieve on the outcomes and what we're measuring. The clinical trials that are coming forward in the space that we're in are enormous. We're fortunate that there's so much science evolving with mucopolysaccharides, but at the same time, what does that mean? What are the questions? What do researchers need to see? What are the answers we have to uncover during these surveys? They're going to be critical for clinical trial design.
Specific to governance, I would say you've just been given a workbook, and so you have a lot more than any of us had when we started. Don't be intimidated. Just get something in writing and review it every 6 months to a year, and don't underestimate the maintenance it takes. I'm not trying to scare you off, but just realize that it's you don't just build it and walk away from it, even if it's free. There's some saying about the horse may be free, but you still have to feed it and clean up after it. And that was about governance, and then just overall is collaboration and not trying to do this on your own.
For me, I think that to Megan's point, don't be afraid of jumping in and doing something, but also know that there's a pool of people out there that are willing to help you. And there's LinkedIn now. There's books. There's resources. People are really not that scary at the NIH. Just a little bit scary, but not that scary. And the FDA. I remember when I went to the Human Genome Celebration back in 1800, and it was I was standing and in the Museum of Natural History was mammoth literally standing over me and thinking, Michael is so dead, because this is so much like math. There is no way I am ever going to understand it. And these people are so very smart. And, some of us have been around for a while, and we've really stood on top of each other's shoulders to get to where we are. And it's all because we've had a lot of help. So reach out and ask for help, because I'll do anything I can to help you. If I can save you a step, because time saves lives. So, call call people, ask for help. We're here to help.
I would say focus on value and creating value. Don't always focus on what it's going to cost. And so many times the registry, the value that you can extract from it is qualitative in nature. It builds your brand, it builds recognition of your disease, it attracts new researchers to the area. How do you quantify that other than researchers joined us this year? And when you're spending a lot of money or signing a 5-year contract and you're trying to get a consultant to come in, it's very easy to become myopic and go back to a dollars and cents conversation. And a registry is really an ambitious goal. It's about creating a much larger value for your disease population. So don't go down that rabbit hole. If somebody tries to pull you down there, which they will at some point, reach out, go back to those strategic goals. If you don't have those goals lined up in agreement at a very high level in your organization, that's when you can get sidetracked.
That's a really good point. I think the things that came to me today weren't so much related to the data. And I think, Shelley, you said this, that listening's important. And I think we don't listen enough. So listening's important. And then the whole communication aspect, and along with communication, lexicon, because we all use words to mean things and we use them differently. And I bet if you asked each of us what a registry is, we'd all give you a different answer. So when you're talking to us and I'm telling you something, you need to say, Liz, what do you mean? You said the word board. Who's on that board? What does it look like? So when you're reaching out to people to get advice, make sure you're using enough prompts so they can explain themselves better. And I think Christian's going to come back up, and we have 55 seconds to spare.
Fantastic job for the panel. Thank you for closing us out so wonderfully today. I'll share, I think, a couple of thoughts that I had too from kind of being with the audience a lot in the day as well. And I think two main things that I really come away from with this great day was number one, from this morning, Meg Dorr's presentation about community and trust, because I think it kept coming back around to the fact that if you want to collect data, you have to have people who trust you to do that, and you have to earn that, and you have to continue to do that. And data begets data when you have conversations that inform them along the way. And we spoke about it from a marketing standpoint, we spoke about it from a communication standpoint, and I think that keeps coming back. It also, the more data-centric your conversations, I've seen this myself, and I think you guys have all shared it in different ways, the more you have data-centric conversations, the more emotions are put where they belong, which is in the passion for the work and in the belief of what you're doing, and they're a little less noisy in the conversation because you can see a little more objectively what the goals are and what the objective is and the big picture of what you're trying to accomplish. There's always going to be emotion, there's always going to be some human dynamics involved, but the data centricity of a project can really help keep things moving along, especially through periods of disagreement or insecurity about what step to take next. I also heard a few times in the comments about pulling in your board, pulling in your high-level decision makers. That's also especially really important, and this ties to the kind of education that we're putting together here. Capacity building and training and teaching organization leaders is not just for you to be able to make the decisions on your own. It's about informing the people that you need to get buy-in from. So these events are also, and the education that we put out there online, are also for your board members and your other staffers, and they're really meant to be talked about and to have these exercises be done jointly, not just as thought exercises for yourselves. So by all means, kind of take that with you as we wrap up. And a little bit of housekeeping here as I forward my slides to the end. So I just want to remind everybody, Data DIY number 3, October 24th and 25th. In Philadelphia. David Feigenbaum, representing the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network, is really going to get into the deep dive of what's been so successful with such an ultra-rare disease around the development of a research community and really centered around clinicians sharing their insights, sharing the load of doing the research, and building a community that then from there also means the foundation is a part of a growing network of patients and working together, kind of creating a virtuous loop to drive research forward. David assembled this group of physicians and researchers and patients to create this network to accelerate research and development of treatments through a targeted, collaborative, patient-centric approach. This new model of more targeted collaboration is one that Global Genes, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Sage Bionetworks, and other leading institutions ardently endorse, and we'll be breaking down this model into its key elements, including a published 8-step model. So we really encourage people to be there for it. It will be just as interactive and just as loaded with kind of more personalized guidance as well. So we hope to see you there. And of course, the Patient Advocacy Summit. Make sure you're there. We'll be waiting for you, and it is a heck of an event. So please do what you can to join us there. And finally, I just wanted to close with some resources from Global Genes. Advocacy@globalgenes.org is the email address we'd really like you to reach out to us through to make sure that you have access to information not only from our resources if you can't find something on the portal or if you wanted to get some more kind of information about something we covered today, but even if you just want to get in contact with our speakers and have a more specific question. They've been amazing all through Data DIY, so I have no reason to think that'll change. And for all of those who've been engaging our resources along the way, we're at the kind of midpoint of the program. So in the next couple of weeks, while you're enjoying your summer, expect to hear from us, and we'll be reaching out for feedback, do some knowledge checks to make sure that you're understanding the concepts that we're going through. And of course, we have to live as we teach, so we'll be making sure that we do some data reflection back to you along the way as well. Thank you so much. And if the audience in the room can hold for a second, we've got some logistics to work through for tomorrow. But that's it from Washington, D.C. Thank you.